All right, I've got time for us to begin. Good to see all of you tonight. Oh, y'all got quiet. Yes. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 tonight. Let me give you just a little bit of a heads up on how I plan to do the class for the rest of this quarter. I will be gone the very last Wednesday night. That's the Wednesday night during Exposure Youth Camp. We'll be with the kids in Huntsville. And so I was looking at the calendar and looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, and if we cover one chapter each evening, we will finish the book on the Wednesday night before I'm gone. Okay, so that's what I'm planning to do. And then probably that Wednesday night with us being gone, we may do something not in any way associated with Ecclesiastes. We'll let you know as that gets closer. But that's, so tonight, chapter 4. That means next Wednesday night, chapter 5. And then the Wednesday night after that, we'll figure that out later. Yeah. All right. All right. We'll go in chronological order. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Chapter 4. Just as we begin, just kind of as a reminder, book of Ecclesiastes written by Solomon, probably late in his life, which would mean it would come after. I don't think it would be right to say during, but I think after the time of his unfaithfulness, when the many foreign women that he loved turned his heart away from God. My personal opinion, the book of Ecclesiastes, I think, is evidence of the fact that Solomon came back to God. I can't see that book being written without that having taken place, unless, and this is certainly possible, the book was written prior to that happening, and that's also possible. But I tend to think the other is the case. Various reasons for that. Really doesn't have anything to do with our lesson tonight. The main theme of the book is the vanity or emptiness or meaninglessness of life when it is lived without God. And the book is almost presented like a sermon. You could almost see this being spoken. And it's set up in such a way as to just emphasize and just drive home the point how empty and how meaningless life is. And he goes with all these different examples, and it's just utterly hopeless. And you get right to the end of the book, and then you have that climactic ending that this is what brings meaning, this is what life's all about as it relates to our respect for and obedience to God. And so as he just develops the book, and I didn't put the outline up, I gave you kind of a rough outline of the book. Where we are right now is in the section of his observations of life around him. Chapters 3, 4, and 5. He sees the people around him, the events and circumstances around him, all of which serves to kind of bolster his point and give support to his thesis that life is without meaning as long as life is lived without God. And so when we come to chapter 4, I've just entitled this Life's Vanities. There's 4 sections in chapter 4, and there are things that you can see around you. Solomon saw them. You can see them as well. Things that show how empty life is when God is left out. The first one has to do with oppression, verses 1 to 3. He said, "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who were already dead, more than the living who were still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. All right, so as Solomon sees people being oppressed, you don't have to look far to see that, do you? I mean, in our day and time, the same thing. People who are taken advantage of, people because of their circumstances are downtrodden and taken advantage of. I mean, it's not something that is limited to a particular time or place. It happens universally. And Solomon recognized that. And here are these people oppressed. You see their tears. It's real. It's genuine. The people that are oppressing them are people who are abusing power. And how many different places is that the case in our world? I mean, think about countries where, sometimes we complain about our government and sometimes we have reason to complain about it. But there are some places where you better not complain about the government. You won't do it more than once because they'll kill you. And, it's really oppressive, very serious human rights violation, all those different things taking place. The power of those that abuse that power. And twice he says in these verses, they have no comforter, nowhere to turn, nobody to give them the care and the aid and the assistance that they need. And if you're living this life, remember, under the sun, without God, if you're living this life without God and you're being oppressed, what hope do you have? There's one thing that sets Christianity apart from everything else in this world, and that is hope. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are here and now. There's something better coming. Romans 8 and verse 18. Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present world are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed. What we can look forward to makes any and everything that we endure and face, regardless of what it is, worthwhile. But if you're living your life without God and you're dealing with those kind of things, look at what Solomon concludes from that. I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Because the dead person's not facing that oppression and that abuse of power like the one who's living. And there's one better than either of those. And that's the person who was never born. Because he's not been oppressed at all. Doesn't exist. And as a result, again, if all you consider is life under the sun, life without God, then the person who was never born is better off than either of those who lived with that kind of treatment. Look at a couple of other passages about this idea of never being born. Job, you remember all the suffering that he endured. Job chapter 3 verse 3, he questioned, why was I even born? He said it far more eloquently than I just did. Let's turn back to Job 3 and notice how Job says it. May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the years. May it not come into the number of the months. And he goes on. You think he was serious about the idea? The way I'm feeling right now, what I'm dealing with right now, I wish I wouldn't have been born. He sounds like he means it. Yeah. What was it Jesus said about the Son of Man being betrayed? Matthew chapter 26, verse 24, he said, it's going to happen. It has to happen. But woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. It was better for him never to have been born. Of course, who was the one who betrayed him? Judas. And so Jesus said it would have been better for Judas never to have been born, never to have existed, than to do what he did and face the consequences of it. Now, again, that idea of never being, that's not the general biblical teaching about man's condition. Sometimes critics of God and the Bible go back and say, if God was all-knowing, then why did he make man knowing that man would sin? Well, obviously there's an answer to that, but that's that same idea. It would have been better never to have created man than for this mess to happen. To which, at least my response to that person would be, oh, really? Are you sure about that? First of all, God, in his infinite wisdom, knows more than and knows better than I do, doesn't he? He even knows more than and better than you, right? And so for me to say, God shouldn't have done that, I'm really speaking out of school, and I really don't have standing to do that. And so when a person says, well, it was better for this person never to have been born, the biblical teaching is what is best for a person, though there may be oppression, there may be suffering, there may be sin in that person's life, what is best is for that person to come to God, come to Christ in our day and time, be obedient to the gospel, have sins forgiven, and, as we noted earlier, have hope beyond this world. And so, what Solomon is saying about it's better for a person never be born, that's always within that context of him saying, here are people living without God. And so, one other thing about this oppression. Person who lives his entire life, never gets a break, never's treated right. Those who perpetrate that, those who do those kind of things, get away with it. Or do they? In the short term, they do, exactly. But ultimately, they do not. Romans 12 and verse 9, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Who said that? That was the Lord. And whatever happens here, God will take care of what needs to be taken care of. And so, even though we face difficulties, oppression, suffering, all those kind of things, inequities, all that kind of thing that happens, we don't have to despair because we know what we have waiting beyond. And we know that God is the final and ultimate judge. And he will take vengeance where it's needed, and he will repay those who, at least as Jimmy said, in the short term, get away with things that you and I look at and say that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen. But why does it happen? And there's one very simple reason why it happens, and that's sin. And because there's sin in this world, that kind of thing will happen. But what Jesus did and what Jesus offers in the gospel takes care of that. And that's the hope that we have, that we obviously would try to seek to share with others. Let me stop there at verse 3. Anything else that you'd like to add? Anything you'd like to say about that first section? All right, next section. I've entitled this Envy, verses 4 through 6. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Now, he's going to go on. There'll be one other thought added to that. But let's go back and look at 4 through 6 and this idea of envy. You work and you have things and your neighbor is envious. Or it's vice versa. Your neighbor works and has things and you're envious. We have a phrase that we sometimes use. We've got two phrases. I'd think of that one, if that was right. The grass is always greener on the other side. I look at what you've got and I wish I had what you had. While many times you may be doing the same thing. The things you don't have is what you wish you did have. I remember years ago, our insurance agent was sitting at the table. We were talking. He was trying to sell insurance, but we were just talking. And he was saying, he had to get our net worth, and bless his heart, it wasn't what he thought it would be, I don't guess. But what he said, I thought was interesting. He said, don't ever think. You know, go these exclusive neighborhoods, you know, you got these big houses and there's 2 big cars and there's you know, maybe a boat or all kind of stuff there. He said, don't ever think, man, I wish I was in that position. He said, because I guarantee you most of those people, they are borrowed up to their eyeballs to be able to have that. So many times when we look at the grass on the other side, it may not be as green as we think it is. It may not be as good. Now, that's one phrase, but the one I was thinking of is keeping up with the Joneses. I don't know why it's the Joneses we pick on, but trying to keep up with, you know, they just traded for a new car, and all of a sudden I look at my car and say, man, I don't like my car anymore. I want a new car. Or, you know, they may, somebody builds a big house. Look, man, my little bitty house, I wish I had a big house. I mean, we get envious of what others have. And so what Solomon does, and notice how he makes it very clear, that attitude is vanity. It's grasping for the wind. No good can come from that. Because once you get that bigger house, guess what? Somebody else has one bigger than you. And, I mean, there's no ending to it. What we need to do instead, as he makes the point kind of in the middle of these next verses, better a handful with quietness. There is, that brings to my mind what Paul wrote in the book of Philippians, that we must learn contentment. He had abounded, he had been abased, he had plenty, he was in want, but he had learned in whatever state to be content. And when you're content, it doesn't matter what you have. If you have enough, then it doesn't matter. And that's obviously the way you deal with that kind of thing. But notice what Solomon does. And I put these up on the board. He talks about 4 different types of people as it relates to work and labor and monetary things. First, there's this industrious man in verse number 4. He toils, he's skillful in his work, and it causes his neighbor to be envious. The next one, there is the idle man. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. The idea, he doesn't work to provide something, and so it's like he is consuming his own life. There's nothing that's being added to it. And then the next one in verse number 6 is the integrated man. The integrated, the idea that he has a balance between labor and leisure, between work and rest. And I've illustrated these. I thought I did. There it is. There's the industrious man. Now, We're not just talking about somebody who works like he ought to work. This is the person who works for the sake of work. And he'll talk about him a little bit more down in verse number 8 and following. It's like the rat on the wheel. Where do you stop? You just don't. All right. Then there's the lazy man. And I didn't want to put a person up there, because I didn't want to pick on somebody. So I just put a dog. But, what does a dog do? Well, usually whatever he wants to do. And so he's lazy. What we have to have is a balance between those two. And Jimmy, you mentioned Denny Petrillo. Yeah, I was thinking that was right. But anyway, Denny is the president out at Bear Valley. And he did a series of studies on the book of Ecclesiastes that's in daily Bible study. Jonathan Jenkins and Eric Owens kind of worked that. Jonathan, I think, is the one who does it more than anybody. Denny did a series of studies on Ecclesiastes. He had a really good illustration on this idea, and you almost see it right here in what Solomon is saying. You've got the fool who folds his hands, and so both hands are empty. And then you've got this industrious man, the workaholic, and he's just grabbing for everything he can, and both hands are full. And so what he's saying, it's better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. And so you need a balance between work, where you grab for what you need to work for, and the hand being empty. The idea of rest, leisure. And we talked about this during our study on stewardship. We talked about the Sabbath. God gave the Sabbath day to the Jews as what kind of day? A day of rest. And they were to do no rest on the Sabbath day. Do no work on the Sabbath day, but they were to rest instead. Just checking, see if you're paying attention. In addition to that, there was every seventh year, they let the land rest. And they were not to plant their crops. And so God taught them the need for a balance between work and rest, between labor and leisure. And you see it here again in Ecclesiastes 4, that you've got this man, and he goes on. And I will go ahead, let me go back to my outline. I've got this listed 7 through 12 as loneliness, but you can kind of tie it back to that as well, because as I mentioned, you've got the industrious man, the idle man, the balanced or integrated man. Then verses 7 and 8, you have the independent worker. And I want you to listen to what he says about him. Verse 7, then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. And so here's somebody who works for the sake of work. He doesn't have anybody to support. He doesn't have a family. He's without companion. He doesn't have a son or a brother. The idea there, no one to inherit what he has. So, and he never stops to ask, why am I working so hard? What is your motive? What is a motive? Let me ask it that way. What is a motive, a good motive for work? To eat, to support yourself, support your family. There are others. What's another one? To save. A little rest once in a while. If you work, you can then rest. To give to others. Contentment. All right, to stay occupied. Ephesians chapter 4 says that those who stole are not to steal anymore, but rather they're to labor, working with their hands so that they will have to give to others. And so there are a number of good, honorable motives for working. And yet here's somebody who just works for the sake of work. And he never stops to ask himself the question, why am I doing this? Now, there's a good place to put a peg down and to kind of back off and look at this. And isn't it a good practice for each of us at times to stop and say, why am I doing this? We can ask it about work, and yet at the same time we could ask about a lot of other things. Anytime we're engaged in something, we could ask, why am I doing this? What is my motive? What is my reason? What do I get out of this? And probably another question you need to put with that. How does this honor God? Does honorable work honor God? Can you think of a passage? What about Colossians 3, verse 23, where Paul makes the point that when you're working, you're not working for man, but you're working for God. In fact, you don't serve with eye service as men pleasers, but you work as if you're working for Christ. And so, whatever it is we're doing, the ultimate question we ask is He honored, is He glorified by what I'm doing? Am I serving Him in doing this? These verses should remind us that it's very easy to get caught up in, and it could be work or it could be any other thing, where we have no purpose, no meaning, and just as he's making the point in this book, it's a vanity and a grave misfortune. And so loneliness is the topic I gave to verses 7 through 8, but you kind of tie it back to the section on envy, and then he's going to give the positive, and Solomon does that quite often in Ecclesiastes, where he deals with, here's what man does when he lives without God, and here's the mess that he makes of his life, and here's what should be instead. There are about 4 or 5 times where he says a man should enjoy what he has. You remember we looked at those verses. Well, verses 9 through 12 that's in this section give us a little bit different view of how we ought to be. We don't live to work. We don't live for, you fill in the blank, whatever it is that is separated from God and from others. But rather there's value in God's people being together, working together, and supporting one another. Verses 9 through 12, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And so you've got this idea of 2 being better than 1. And I'm going to go back, Brother Petrillo's class on Ecclesiastes. He gave 4 things in these verses that illustrate the idea that 2 are better than 1. 1, 2 are more productive than 1. I remember years ago reading something about, this is back when, before tractor pulls, they would use horses or mules or something to pull things at county fairs. And the one that pulls the most wins, just like the way tractor pulls are now. But at this one particular state fair, and I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the Midwest, they decided after the competition, the two that were at the end, they hooked them together to see how much they could pull. Now you would think, whatever the amount was, that the one pull that won and the one that came in second, you add those together, that's what they could pull, right? They actually pulled far more than that. And Brother Petrillo gave an illustration of a study that was done where there were two people doing jobs, and each one was sent to do a job by himself. And it took, I think it was 5 days to do it. Then they sent them together to do similar jobs, and they were able to complete both of them in half the time. So when two are together, they're more productive. You think of a Bible illustration of two working together like that. What about the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys? When you think about the missionary journeys of Paul, it was Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas, Paul and Timothy. There's always somebody with him as he's working. When Jesus sent the apostles out on the limited commission, he sent them by pairs, 2 and 2. And so there's always better productivity when two are working together. The old adage that I think comes from this, 2 heads are better than 1. And so, number 1, 2 are better than 1 because they're more productive. Look at verse number 2. Or point number 2 in verse number 10. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone. When he falls, he has no one to help him up. I did the same thing. When I read that, I was thinking, if you didn't hear what Hal said, the lady said, I've fallen and I can't get up. That's exactly the point that he's making. But if somebody's with you, then how many accidents happen where a person's by himself and he's hurt? If somebody had been there, it would not have been as severe. And so, for a matter of care for each other, the 2 are better than 1. Look at verse 11. And this may be lost on us because of the way we can have heated houses and that kind of thing today. But if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be kept warm alone? Okay. Right. Right. It is. And so for warmth, 2 are better than 1. And then verse number 12, for safety. If one is overpowered by another, but 2 could withstand him. And so if you go into a dangerous area alone, you may be asking for trouble. But if you have somebody with you, it's far less likely for something to happen. And so each of these illustrate the fact that 2 will always be better than 1. In a lot of different reasons. But there's one other phrase in that. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. And you can take 3 ropes and braid them together. And they're very, very strong. Far stronger than any one of those by themselves. But notice in each of these 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and then 3. Now, the third party there, God. Solomon doesn't say that, but I think that's the implication. Far stronger than 2 is when you add God to it. That's what he's done throughout this whole book. Throughout the whole book, he's looked at man just alone, man under the sun, and then he would add, but if God is in the picture, how different it is. And I think that's exactly what this statement does. When you add God to the equation, it changes. And so when it comes to either being productive or having care for each other or even warmth or safety, when you bring God into it, it's even far greater than what we have just among ourselves. All right, down through verse number 12. Any thoughts you'd like to add? Question you'd like to raise? Tom? Mm-hmm. 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 And that illustrates exactly what we're seeing here. Yeah. Yeah.
An illustration, and I'm thinking of David's time, that the father had his son break a single stick, and then they bundled the sticks together, and none of them could break.
That may be. I've seen that illustration done. From Greek mythology. Uh-huh. Yeah. It increases the strength. Yeah, in a far more. Yeah. Now, I have seen that illustration go wrong. A friend of mine at camp was illustrating the idea of strength and unity. And he had pencils, and he had one of the teenage boys come up and break a pencil. It's easy. He just snapped it in two. Then he had, a larger number of them. He said, now, see if you can break these. And he just snapped them all in two. And he said, well, there goes that illustration. Let's move on to the next point. So it doesn't always work. You have to be careful, make sure your illustration is going to work. But there may be a passage, Howell, that has that. Here's your homework for next week. Look and see if you can find that, if it's in there. And if you find it in the next 6 minutes, let us know. All right, anything else over down to verse number 12? All right, now verses 13 through 16 are somewhat difficult. Let's read them, and then I'll kind of go back and tell you what I think we see in it. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice with him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. One of the first things I want to say about those verses is when I read verse number 13, I can't help thinking, as Solomon writes those words, he's got to think, I've been both of those. Oh, poor, maybe not poor, but wise youth. As a young king, what was his prayer to God? for wisdom. But then an old and foolish king. And when those foreign women turned his heart away from God, he became an old, foolish king. And so I think that verse more than any just brings Solomon to mind. But it's almost like he's telling a story that there are two kings. You have this old, foolish king who's not going to be admonished anymore, and you got this young man. And though he was in prison for whatever reason, think about Joseph. Joseph was in prison in Genesis 39. He was wrongly imprisoned, but he was in prison. Came out of that to be the second most powerful person in Egypt. And so it's something similar to that. Here he comes out of prison to be king, even though he was born poor. And so one of the lessons I think we take from this section, wealth and position is not a guarantee of success. How many times have we thought, if I just had blank, I would be far more successful? You know, if I just had a better job, if I just had more money in the bank, if I just had, you know, whatever it is, things would be so much easier, so much better. Wealth, position do not equal success. Here's this king. He's old, but he's foolish. Secondly, poverty and temporary setbacks are not barriers to success. Just because things are not the way I want them to be doesn't mean they have to stay that way. Just because I've had problems, just because I've had difficulties, doesn't mean I cannot overcome those. He was born poor in his kingdom. He was in prison, and yet he came out of that to become king. The key, the difference is wisdom. When we have wisdom, then we can overcome the barriers and we can take advantage of those things that we have. And we can succeed. Obviously, why it may be true of material things, we're talking ultimately of spiritual success. And we can be, I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've done. I don't care what condition you're in right now. You can be what God wants you to be. You can live faithfully for Him. Look at the examples in the Bible of people who messed up and messed up royally. And yet they came out of that to be servants of God. And so the key is the application of wisdom that comes from the will of God. Now, the story takes just a turn right at the end. Here this young man has come out of prison, come out of poverty to become king. But then, those people over whom he was made king, others come afterward and they do not rejoice in him. Man is fickle. You cannot please everybody. And since that's true, who should we try to please? God. And when you please God, it doesn't matter what people think. And that's what Ecclesiastes chapter 4 tells us. And I didn't put that last one up, position, verses 13 through 16. All right, anything else real quickly before we have the buzzer? Remember next week, Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We'll continue looking at what Solomon had to say of the things that he observed and how it affects his theme in the book concerning the vanity of life lived without God. I appreciate your input into the class tonight. If you'll take a songbook and be turning to number 32. Number 32 will be our invitation song this evening. The song's entitled The Great Physician. A lot of different titles, a lot of different descriptions given to Jesus. But the Great Physician draws on his miraculous powers, the healings that he performed. You think about the various things that Jesus did. Peter's mother-in-law with a fever. He healed her and she immediately got up and served. Or you think about the withered hands or the lame feet, the blindness, the deafness, all of those different things that Jesus was able to heal, to do what could not be done by just mere humans. In fact, John chapter 9, when the blind man was given his sight, the man who had been born blind, he made the statement that not since the beginning of time has it been heard that someone opened the eyes of one born blind. But Jesus did. But his miraculous healing points to something even greater. And that's what the song talks about. The fact that he has the solution for our sin sickness, to use that figure of speech. Of course, sin is not a sickness, but it's figured in that way. The only solution that we have, one of the things that Jesus healed, and at the time in which he healed this particular disease, there was no known cure. And that, of course, the disease was leprosy. And the Bible uses the figure of leprosy to represent sin throughout the Bible. And so what Jesus does is enable us to be forgiven of something we could not take care of ourselves. He's able to take away something that is a burden that we could not unload. As we sing tonight about the great physician, encourage you. Give thought to your condition. Do you need the great physician to operate in your life? Do you need the forgiveness that he and he alone can give? Maybe as a child of God, you've wandered from the way that's right. Maybe you're not a Christian. You need to be baptized into Christ. Whatever the reason tonight, if you find yourself in need of responding, won't you come right now while we stand, while we sing. Just a moment, Drew Gullion will lead us in our closing prayer. Let me mention some on the sick list. John Holly said his mother, Terry Putnam, underwent surgery this week, had some complications from that. She is at Huntsville Hospital. Ask that we keep her in our thoughts and prayers. Also, Darlene Juleson's mother, Joanne Mobies, has gone to the ER. She was having some, was it dizziness? high fever, had a high fever, and they're not exactly sure what the problem is. So be sure and keep Darlene's mother in your prayers. Hannah Beth Johnson is sick at home tonight. Also, Cole Henson has been sick. I don't see him. I think he may still be under the weather, so keep Cole in your prayers as well. Cindy's mother, Kathleen Dowdy, in rehab following a recent fall. Lincoln Callis, undergoing treatment at St. Jude's. Also, Gayla Terry. Gayla and Lincoln not with us tonight. She is about halfway through her treatment, so be sure and continue to keep Gayla in your prayers as she continues her chemotherapy. Anybody else we need to add tonight? All right, Wesley Uding has RSV. That's Glenna's great-grandson. Anybody else we need to add? All right, some things coming up tonight, right after we dismiss. We're going to be putting together some of the bags that we sent home from Gitega. If you would like to help, or if you miss your kids, probably they're down there helping. We'll do that in Annex right after our service tonight. Remember, Sunday night is our singing and prayer service. And if I remember the theme, counting our blessings. So, men, keep that in mind as you prepare for that. We're 10 days away from our coat drive, November the 12th. So it's coming up rather quickly. An update on what we need? Okay, all right. Anything you bring, though, would certainly be useful. And above all things, keep it in your prayers. Plan to be here and help on that Saturday, if at all possible. And speaking of Saturday, it is the time for the time change. Set your clocks back an hour before going to bed Saturday night. We fall back, and that way you'll be on right time Sunday morning. Anything else we need to add tonight? Drew, if you would dismiss us.
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day, and thank you for everything you've given us, and thank you for allowing us to come out here tonight and learn about you, and let us take what we've learned and apply it to our lives so we can become better Christians and spread your word. And be with all the people that's on our sick list tonight, and just watch over them and heal them as in a way only you can. And just be with us. Let us always strive to do your will, and everything that we do let us do pleasing in your sight. And just most of all, thank you for sending your Son to die on the cross for the remissions of our sins, so that we may have the hope of going to heaven and being with you one day. And just be with us as we go throughout the remainder of this day, and keep us safe, and let us come back here, and if it be your will, next time, and learn about you some more, and keep us safe. In Jesus' name we pray.